So I'm going to go over the basics of what you need to know about the judicial branch for your test and take a look at those two objectives. Those are the two things that they have identified, and especially for the end of course exam that you have to be able to know about the judicial branch. The first one's a catch-all, identify the structure and function of each branch of government. And then the second one applies specifically to the judicial branch. Remember the one you had to watch about the federal court system and the purpose of each level. So if we get started, we remember the purpose of the judicial branch is to interpret the law. The legislative branch makes them. The president's job then is to put together the agencies that will enforce them. But the whole purpose of the judicial branch is to interpret those laws. And if we think about what interpret means, I know I always say it at you, interpret is to say what something means. So when you interpret a poem, you say what that poem means. When you interpret a law, you do two things. You say what that law means, but you also say, how should we apply this law? So as an example, let's take a look at the First Amendment and just about that one section that says, Congress shall make no law representing an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise or abridging the freedom of speech. So does that mean all speech? Does that mean that all speech should always be protected, whether it is obscene, whether it's racist, whether it's offensive, whether it could lead to someone getting killed, whether it violates someone's rights, whether it's slander or libel? It's the Supreme Court who, after our founding fathers wrote this Constitution, it's the Supreme Court who then, through a series of rulings, which you spent a lot of time with over the last week or so, decided what exactly that means. And you know that some of the ways that they've interpreted it are that speech is protected as long as it does not cause actual imminent harm to another person. But when I say that the Supreme Court and the judicial branch job is to interpret the laws, that's what I mean. I mean, any of those phrases in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. They had to interpret what that means, and especially interpret what it means as the world changes. Does freedom of speech protect speech on the internet? Does freedom of speech protect your Instagram? What about images? All that has been the job of the judicial branch. Another crucial purpose of the judicial branch, and in this case specifically the Supreme Court, is that power they have to decide if laws passed by national or state governments violate the Constitution. And they do that through that process called judicial review. So the structure of specifically the federal court system, this is that pyramid. I need you to remember we're always going to start at the bottom, and we're going to start with the district courts. Remember, there are 94 districts, so you know that there's at least one in every state, and then of course in states that are larger in population, there's going to be more than one. And I need you to remember the phrase original jurisdiction. That means first. That's what original sometimes means. If someone was the original gangster, for example, they were the first gangster. Original jurisdiction is that they have that first authority to hear federal cases, and we'll talk about the difference between federal cases and state cases in a minute. But for now, I need you to remember the phrase original jurisdiction. And in 99.9 and really 99999% of federal cases, you're always going to start at the district court level. We'll talk about a few exceptions to that, but the best thing you can remember is it always starts at the district level. Now, if you lose at the district level, one of the things you can do is to appeal or to ask for someone to review the evidence. And you don't always get your appeal granted. But when you ask for an appeal, your next level is the courts of appeals, or I need you to remember that they're also called the circuit courts. Remember, this map shows the circuits. You can see that in this case, Florida, Georgia, and the like are part of the 11th Circuit. Of course, you don't need as many district courts because not all district cases are going to be appealed, but those that are going to go to that next level. There are, as you can see, 13 circuits. This is where you go if you lose a case. These courts have no original jurisdiction. They never, ever hear a case first. There's the very, very rare occasion in the Supreme Court where they have original jurisdiction, but the appeals courts never do, and that makes sense because they're called appellate courts or appeals courts. So their only purpose is to hear appeals. Now, the Supreme Court, that highest court in the land, the highest court of appeal, if you lose at the circuit court level or the appeals court level, you may ask under a writ of certiorari, you may ask the Supreme Court to hear your case. Remember that they only hear a very, very small percentage of the cases people ask them to hear. But if they take your case, then your case may be appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now, there are a very, very few number of cases that will be heard first by the U.S. Supreme Court. And I'll give you one example because these are generally not terribly important for you to memorize. But in the case where a member of the federal government is being accused of something, it may be tried in the Supreme Court. In the case of, or if it's a case between two states, then it may very well be tried in the Supreme Court. They may have the original jurisdiction. But generally, I want you to associate the phrase original jurisdiction with the U.S. district courts. So when we're talking about federal laws and cases, remember I asked you to remember that we had a dual court system. So you have your state courts, you have your county courts, your state courts that handle a majority of the cases that happen in a particular state, but then you also have this federal court system. So entirely separate from this structure, you have a series of state courts, which have their own courts of appeal as well. If we're dealing with crimes that are identified by state statute or state crime, they're going to be tried in state courts. What makes something a federal case or a federal law are these are a couple of examples of something that would make something a federal case. The first and most obvious one is that if it's violating the Constitution, of course, the United States Constitution, which is a federal government document, if you feel like your constitutional rights, think First Amendment, Second Amendment right to bear arms, if you feel that any of your constitutional rights have been violated, you're going to start here in the district court. Crimes that involve multiple states, or in this case, you might consider crimes that require the resources of law enforcement in multiple states, possibly to capture them. So in this case, drug dealing laws or laws to prevent drug dealing have been passed at the federal level. Mob activity, when we're talking about organized crime, racketeering, that's been identified as a federal crime. And kidnapping, too, has been identified as a federal crime. Consider how you might want multiple states' law enforcement working together in this case instead of competing against each other. The couple that should be obvious to you that affect the federal government directly, tax evasion. By specifically, I mean your federal taxes. Remember that there are states that have their own taxes, but if you have evaded or failed to pay your federal taxes, the federal government is going to come after you and you're going to be in federal court. Or counterfeiting, because as you will start to learn about when we get to the legislative branch, printing money is obviously a federal power. It's not concurrent. That shouldn't surprise you. There are not Florida dollars and Georgia dollars and Alabama dollars. So the fact that we have federal money, standard federal money, if you are counterfeiting or printing fake money, that's going to be a federal crime. Conflicts that happen in the sea, maritime is what that refers to. Those are going to be considered a federal case because they happen in not land, but happen in a place that doesn't belong to any one state, or conflicts between two states. Quick about federal judges. We talked about a lot of this quite recently. All federal judges, not just the Supreme Court, but all of them. Each of these courts is appointed by the president. Remember, as a nod to checks and balances, the president's appointees don't immediately become law. They have to then be confirmed by the Senate through a process called advice and consent. Please remember the phrase consent meaning agreement. The Senate has to approve the people appointed by the president. These people are not elected. A lot of the political or government, officials that we are hearing about, presidents, representatives, senators, a lot of them are elected, but federal judges are not. And that makes a lot of sense because you don't want someone whose job it is to rule on cases and to be impartial and not take one side or the other. You don't want them to be dependent on the public for their position and have to campaign for it. Other thing to remember, the federal judges serve for life. Unlike those other government officials, they serve for life unless they are impeached. Remember, there is a process by which an official, like a federal judge and the president as well, can be removed from office, and that's by the legislative branch. Real quick, I'm only going to talk about one of these three. Please make sure you remember them. You need to know these, and they're not going to come up again until right before we take our test and review. So one more won't hurt you. The one I'm going to talk about briefly is Marbury v. Madison, because that one we haven't talked about as much in class as the others. The whole point of Marbury v. Madison is that it's the first time we have the idea of judicial review. Now, as civic students, we associate the Supreme Court has a few jobs, and one of them is definitely to declare laws unconstitutional. We memorize that, but we don't realize that that's nowhere in the Constitution. In fact, that came about because of this case. Now, I won't force you to remember the details of this case, but I need you to memorize the idea of judicial review and declaring laws unconstitutional and associate that with Marbury v. Madison. Take a look at this quote here. This is a quote from the majority opinion, and it's a fairly important one. You might want to memorize it. It is emphatically or definitely the province or job. So it's emphatically the job of the judicial department to say what the law is. And not just to say what the law is, but to say what the law means and how the law should be applied, which goes back to our first slide, which was about how the Supreme Court does the interpretation of the law. There's these three. I don't have anything to say about them. You certainly need to commit them to memory. Make sure you know them. If you get them real solidly in your brain now, they'll be easier to put back in your brain right before we take our test. And then 4 other words that I want you to remember, other ones that won't come up again probably while we're talking about the executive and legislative branch, so it's worth making sure you know them. Remember that before you ever, if you're accused of a crime, no matter what, before you ever get to trial, before you ever get to trial, you are going to know that there is a grand jury that convenes. And the purpose of the grand jury is to look at the evidence, look at all the evidence, and decide, is there even enough evidence to go to trial? And when this process of indictment, or if you get indicted, that means that the grand jury has decided that there is enough evidence and it should go to trial. They do not decide if you are guilty or not. Probable cause, remember this is crucial, this is part of the Fourth Amendment, is that there can't be searches or, of course, arrests, no violation of your constitutional rights unless there's reasonable suspicion. That warrant, also guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment, has to be signed by a judge based on probable cause in order for law enforcement to search or arrest you. You know, there's an arrest warrant as well. An eminent domain, which will not come up again, we didn't talk too much about, but which certainly, I think you're going to do a teen biz about it, but which certainly I would expect to encounter on my test. The eminent domain is part of the Fifth Amendment. An eminent domain is that right that the federal government has to confiscate your property. Usually we're talking about land, so long as they ultimately compensate you for it or pay you a fair price for it. Good timing. My phone just rang. I'll see you in class. Good luck on your test.